Also, let's take you back to that province, to Durban, for our special coverage where we are speaking to, of course, the News at Prime anchor, Xoli Mgambi, who's speaking about the ever-rising violent crimes in that province. Now, Xoli, earlier on, as we began this deep delve, you aptly described the situation in that province as low-intensity war between police and criminals. Tell us more.
Indeed, Masa, a very good evening to you once again. If you're just joining us, we are coming to you live from the province of KwaZulu-Natal, Durban, to be specific. And criminality in this province can only be dealt with by effective law enforcement. But what does that mean in practice? Because many a times the police in this province have had confrontations, direct confrontation with the criminals who appear armed and ready to go to war. But there is also this criticism towards the police that they are somewhat heavy-handed when confronting these criminals. So how do police balance between doing their work and being seen to be even-handed versus people who are essentially armed to the teeth? So, joining us for this conversation is Professor Nirmala Gopal. She is with the University of KwaZulu-Natal's Criminology and Forensics Department. Professor Gopal, good evening to you, and thank you very much for your time. Let's deal with that contentious issue of police being seen on the one hand to be heavy-handed, but communities certainly appreciate when they see that police officers are responding and are responding with force towards violent criminals.
Good evening, Cody, and thank you so much for having me here, and good evening to your listeners. Yes, I think a very important yet contentious topic, as you rightfully mentioned. I think, you know, whilst we say and we acknowledge the fact that law enforcement is probably the most important body or institution that's responsible to ensure that, you know, we have a safe and secure country, etc., I think we should expand that debate a little to the fact that communities are equally responsible in terms of ensuring that we are safe, etc. But having said that, I think something that we are also aware of in South Africa, and perhaps even KwaZulu-Natal in particular, is we seem to have, or the outside world seems to have this notion that we are particularly violent by nature. And what I mean by that is that, you know, gender-based violence is quite high, homicide rates are quite high, murder, drive-by shootings, etc., are relatively high in comparison to other provinces in the country. But I think even more important as a criminologist is to find out, why do we have the amount of violence that we do in KZN? Because whilst we know, yes, the communities celebrate almost when they hear that police have met fire with fire, for example, because they believe quite often the criminal justice system doesn't do justice to perpetrators of these kind of crimes or violence. So on the one hand, yes, our communities are very happy about it, but on the other hand, like you say, we've got to balance the law as well, in terms of every person has a right to be safe and secure, for example, and that will include your criminals, until, of course, they meet with the justice system, which is the legitimate body that will actually mete out the punishment that's necessary after going through a free and fair trial. So that makes it a little bit difficult. However, I think let's take it even further. Why are we a province with high rates of violence, for example? Right. What are we doing wrong, or what are we not doing that's causing these high rates of violence? And I think that perhaps is a very important question for us to ask, not just from you know, an academic perspective or from the Ministry of Policing, but you know, a kaleidoscope of departments that should get together and find out, what is actually causing this violent behavior and allowing itself to play out in such a violent, bloody way?
Do you have an answer to that very question you are asking, Professor?
So perhaps 10 years ago or 20 years ago, I would have had a more conclusive answer, but I think as time passes, the issues become more complex. But one of my, from my own experience and having researched around issues of violence for almost 2 decades, etc., I think we certainly need a comprehensive program. And the strategy for that is a comprehensive strategy, holistic, where we deal with different domains. For example, we deal with parenting, for example, what happens in the home, what happens in the community, what happens in places of worship, what happens in the school, for example. Are these various institutions speaking to each other in a way that is pro-peace? For me, what is happening at the moment is that we have some communities or particular communities that have pro-violence norms, and these violent norms are being entrenched in the school, in the community, and in the home.
Yeah.
And what I'm suggesting is that can we turn that conversation, that narrative around to a pro-peace narrative? But obviously it needs a multitude of stakeholders who come in with very similar attitudes and the mindset of wanting to reduce crime and violence in the communities and ultimately in South Africa.
There's a particular question, Professor, that interests me, and it harks back to the very first question we dealt with, that police officers are celebrated by communities when they are seen to be meeting fire with fire. However, they are human beings as well. They are mothers, they are fathers. And when you have taken the life of another human being, what is the way of debriefing, trying to look back at what has happened tonight or perhaps the night before? How do police deal with that psychologically? There's a lot of death and violence here in KZN, and some of it lately, it's from the police's side toward criminals. Of course, police should not die with their guns in their hands, as the former Minister of Police would often say. But how do police deal with that?
So I think that's a very difficult situation for police. I mean, at the end of the day, let's be honest, they are human beings as well, with blood and flesh and thoughts and feelings, etc. And so I'm going to approach it in 2 ways. First, I'm going to speak about it from the perspective of police, and then I will go to the other side. So in terms of police and having to witness, the violence and themselves be participating in that violence cannot be easy, because at the end of the day, they got to go home, lay their heads on the pillow and have questions that they themselves ask. And of course, within the police, there are psychologists who help them to debrief, etc., when they experience these violent behavior and acts, etc. And then, of course, we have accused, perpetrators, etc. Yeah. And again, human beings. And we live in a country where we say that every human being has the right to live, for example. So when we shoot to kill, we are taking away that right. However, having said that, the Criminal Procedure Act is very categorical in terms of the amount of force that police officers can actually use. So it should be proportionate and reasonable. Yeah. And I think that's where some of the biggest challenges lie, is how and when do we actually prove that the amount of force that was used was actually proportionate and reasonable. And those are still some gray areas, and I'm not sure how we would win that war.
Yeah. We then move to the topic of whether or not the police are winning the war against crime and violent crime. KZN is a special province because you even have targeted killings. You have assassins for hire in this province. When you hear the statistic that 18 people are murdered in this province on a daily basis, what does that tell us about whether or not police are winning the war against violent crime in KZN?
I think I'd like to start to answer that question by saying 18 per day is unnecessarily high. I mean, 1 per day is high, and 18, I mean, that is really, it's ridiculous. And I think if we had to take a deeper dive into that particular statistic, I don't think it's rocket science to tell us that we're not winning the war against violent crime. And if we look at statistics if we had to compare the pattern of statistics for murder, for example, over a couple of years, and if we see that it's increasing, then it means we're getting even poorer and more ineffective in terms of our policing. Why aren't we introducing ways in which to prevent rather than react? So prevention rather than reaction. And I'm not sure that we're doing that. And if we are doing it, we're not doing that effectively at the moment, be it the police from the side of the police or from the side of the multiple stakeholder communities. Definitely we're not winning that.
I want us to try and wrap the conversation now, but as we do that, whilst we let from the conversation about whether police are winning the war against violent crime to whether they are well equipped themselves. Earlier, I had a conversation with the leader of Pop Crew in the province who says that the older generation of police officers is retiring at the age 55, and they seem to feel that they shouldn't be let go, those people, because the more experience they have, the better it is that they're able to deal with this situation. But the truth is, or the reality is, that there is a much younger cohort of police officers coming in. Do you think that experience counts, and how do the young officers who are coming into the job in such a violent province, how do you think they are going to fare in this instance?
So yeah, the first thing is that I think young officers coming into a province that is so violent is just so unfair to them. I mean, it's you know, fear of the unknown. You don't know, I mean, you're a new recruit, you're excited about this job, and yet at the back of your mind, you know that there's so much of violence that you can encounter during the course of your duty, and that can't be easy on a young mind especially. I think in terms of the older personnel, and if older personnel are saying that, you know, if from their side they believe they still have more to contribute, then that's something that the Ministry of Police should actually investigate, open up that conversation on who, I mean, of course, after vetting and going through a series of testing, psychological, etc., to find out those who are still competent, then perhaps they should allow them to stay on. Why allow them to leave when the skills, the knowledge, the energies, and the right attitude still exist amongst them? Yeah. So that's the one issue. Of course, allowing and then I think what we could have is the fact that you'd have older people or older employees who could then mentor, support, and even inject in very subtle ways confidence in the younger employees. But I think most importantly, Cody, is yes, we do the police service does the initial entry test, the training for 6 months of training, etc. Are we ensuring that we continuously train? Are we ensuring, you know, to upskill, for example, to respond to the new challenges, to respond in ways that are proactive rather than reactive?
Yeah.
Do we also ensure that psychologically we are testing or we are assessing to make sure that our police officers are still psychologically content? Are they strong enough to manage? Are they strong enough to ensure that they're not trigger happy, for example? And I think those, unless we invest in these kind of initiatives, it's going to be very difficult for us as a country.
You end this conversation on a very crucial point, because it's one of those that we touched on with the Prof crew leader, the mental health of police officers. And we did have a conversation about the increasing suicide rate within the police force. But that's a conversation we are going to have with the police commissioner in KwaZulu-Natal. For the time being, I want to thank my guest, Professor Nirmala Gopal. Thank you so much for your time.